In the early 1700s, when faith was not just belief but survival, the Ravencroft family arrived on American soil with one conviction burned into their bones: God must be feared, or he will abandon you. They did not come seeking freedom. They came seeking control over sin, control over weakness, control over the quiet terror that followed them across the Atlantic. To their neighbors, the Ravencrofts looked like the ideal colonial family: disciplined, reserved, devout. Their clothes were always clean, their children obedient, their prayers longer than anyone else's. But there was something unsettling about them, something people felt but couldn't explain. They never laughed. Not once did anyone recall hearing joy come from the Ravencroft home. Only prayer, only silence, only the low, steady sound of scripture being read as if it were law, not comfort. Inside their home, fear was not a consequence of wrongdoing. It was the method. Children were taught that love was dangerous, kindness was weakness, and mercy was an invitation for God's wrath. Every mistake was punished, every question discouraged, every doubt treated like infection, and slowly, quietly, fear became their religion. The family patriarch preached that salvation came through suffering, that pain was proof of devotion, that a child who cried was a child still filled with sin. So crying was trained out of them. Meals were eaten in silence. Prayers lasted for hours. Punishments were delivered calmly, without anger, which somehow made them worse, because anger passes, cold conviction does not. Neighbors began to notice strange patterns. Children were rarely seen outside. No visitors were welcomed after sunset, and every night, without fail, candles burned long after other homes went dark. Some said it was devotion, others said it felt like surveillance. What no one understood yet was that the Ravencrofts were not preparing for heaven. They were preparing for judgment. They believed God was always watching, not lovingly but critically, waiting for weakness, waiting for failure. And if God was watching, then so was something else. As years passed, the family built a small private chapel near their home. Officially, it was for prayer, a sacred place for reflection. Unofficially, it became something far more disturbing. Children were taken there for correction. Confessions were demanded, not offered. Repentance was enforced, not chosen. And beneath the chapel, where no sunlight reached, something darker began to take root. But at this stage, no one could prove anything. No bodies, no witnesses, no crimes that could be named. Just an atmosphere, an unease that followed the Ravencroft name wherever it was spoken. People avoided them, but never confronted them. In a world ruled by faith, questioning a family that appeared more religious than anyone else felt dangerous. And that silence gave the Ravencrofts permission to push further, to punish harder, to believe that whatever they did, God would approve. Because when fear becomes holy, anything can be justified. Session 1 does not end with blood, it ends with foundation. The foundation of a belief system where suffering was sacred, where obedience mattered more than humanity, and where the line between God's will and human cruelty quietly disappeared. Everything that followed, every disappearance, every scream, every unanswered question, grew from this moment, from a family that didn't just believe in God. They feared him so much that they stopped listening when he should have told them to stop. The first disappearance did not begin with violence. It began with obedience. In the winter of 1712, the village surrounding the Ravencroft chapel was already uneasy. The air felt heavier that season. Conversations lowered whenever the family's name was spoken. People didn't accuse them of anything, not openly, but there was an unspoken understanding that something about the Ravencrofts did not sit right. And then a child vanished. His name was Thomas Miller, 9 years old, quiet, well-behaved, the kind of boy no one worried about because he never caused trouble. On the night he disappeared, Thomas attended evening prayer at the Ravencroft chapel. His parents were proud of him for going. Attendance at the Ravencroft services was seen as a sign of moral seriousness. The family's reputation for discipline still carried weight, even admiration, despite the unease. Thomas entered the chapel just before sunset. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. There was no scream, no struggle, no sudden panic, which is why it took hours before anyone realized something was wrong. When the service ended, the congregation filtered out quietly, as always. The Ravencrofts exited last. Their children walked in straight lines, eyes down, hands folded. Thomas never came out. At first, people assumed he had left early, or perhaps stayed behind to help clean. Children were often encouraged to show devotion through service. But when his parents noticed his bed untouched that night, concern turned into fear. By morning, the village was searching. Men combed the snow-covered roads. Women checked barns and nearby woods. The frozen ground showed no tracks leading away from the chapel. No signs of running, no marks of resistance. It was as if Thomas had simply stopped existing. When questioned, the Ravencrofts responded calmly, too calmly. They confirmed Thomas had attended prayer. They confirmed he sat quietly. They confirmed nothing unusual happened. Then they ended the conversation. No offers of help, no shared concern, no visible alarm, just certainty. And certainty in moments like that is unsettling. As the day passed, whispers began. Someone mentioned that Thomas had looked frightened during prayer. Another claimed they heard unusual chanting after the service officially ended. A farmer said his dog refused to go near the chapel that night, digging its paws into the snow, whining, pulling back hard on the leash. But there was no proof, and in a deeply religious community, accusing a devout family without evidence was dangerous. That night, something happened that no one could explain. Just before dawn, the chapel bell rang. Once, long, slow. There was no one there to pull the rope. Several villagers heard it. They stepped outside into the freezing air, watching the dark outline of the chapel against the pale sky. The bell echoed across empty fields, then fell silent. When they reached the building, the doors were locked from the inside. The bell rope hung motionless. No footprints led to or from the entrance. From that moment on, fear replaced confusion. Thomas Miller was never found. No body surfaced. No grave was discovered. No belongings turned up. It was as if the chapel had swallowed him whole. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes began to appear. Children refused to attend prayer alone. Parents noticed nightmares, the same ones described in eerily similar ways. Dreams of darkness beneath the chapel, dreams of voices calling them by name. The Ravencrofts, however, seemed unaffected. They continued their services, continued their routines, continued to preach obedience and repentance. When asked about Thomas, they offered a single explanation. God sometimes calls his most sinful children home early. That sentence spread through the village like poison. It implied blame, it implied judgment, and most disturbingly, it implied justification. If Thomas was sinful, then his disappearance was deserved. That logic silenced people, because if they questioned it, they risked being next. Soon after, attendance at the Ravencroft chapel dropped. Families prayed privately. Doors stayed shut after dark. People avoided the building, walking wide circles around it, but avoidance didn't bring peace. The bell continued to ring at odd hours, always once, always alone, sometimes during storms, sometimes on clear nights, never during scheduled services, just enough to remind everyone that the chapel was still awake. And then there were the sounds, low, indistinct noises drifting from beneath the structure late at night. Not screams, something worse. Rhythmic murmurs, as if multiple voices were reciting something together slowly, deliberately. People argued about what they were hearing. Some claimed it was imagination. Others said it was wind through old stone. But everyone agreed on one thing: it didn't sound like prayer. Years later, When historians reviewed village records, they noticed something strange. After Thomas disappeared, the Ravencrofts began recording longer sermon durations, sometimes lasting entire nights. No details were included, just start times, end times, attendance numbers, names were never listed, as if anonymity was intentional, as if what happened during those hours was never meant to be remembered, only repeated. Session 2 ends not with answers but with a shift. Because Thomas Miller was not the last child to vanish, he was the first. And once the Ravencrofts realized that fear could erase questions, that faith could silence suspicion, that devotion could become a shield, they stopped being careful. The chapel had taken one child, and nothing had stopped it. For years after Thomas Miller vanished, no one openly accused the Ravencrofts of wrongdoing. But no one trusted them either. Fear had settled into the village like a second winter, quiet, heavy, and impossible to escape. People learned to live around it. They changed routes to avoid the chapel. They lowered their voices when passing Ravencroft land. They taught their children not to ask questions. And still, something kept pulling people back. Curiosity, guilt, or the belief that if they stayed close to God, nothing bad could happen to them. That belief is what filled the chapel on certain nights, not every night, only specific ones. There was no announcement, no written notice, no public invitation, just word of mouth, passed carefully, selectively, about special sermons. Sermons meant for the truly faithful. Those chosen were told to arrive after sunset, alone, no children, no questions, and most importantly, they were told not to speak about what they witnessed. For a long time, no one did, until one person broke. Her name does not appear in official records. Historians later found only a vague reference, a former domestic servant, buried in an unrelated legal dispute decades later. But her testimony changed everything. She worked for the Ravencrofts for nearly 7 years, cooking, cleaning, caring for the younger children. She described the household as cold, but orderly, controlled. What disturbed her most wasn't violence, it was precision. Punishments were never emotional, never chaotic. They were deliberate, measured, and carried out if following instructions written long before anyone in the room was born. She said the children were trained not to cry. Crying, she was told, invited attention, and attention in the Ravencroft home was rarely a good thing. One night, she was instructed to prepare food, but not to attend the evening service. That alone was unusual. Servants were normally required to be present. As she cleaned the kitchen, she noticed something she had never seen before. A door behind the altar, partially open. She was never meant to see it. Inside, stone steps led downward. She followed at a distance when the family and their chosen guests began to descend. She stayed hidden, listening. What she heard stayed with her for the rest of her life. The sermons below the chapel were nothing like the ones above. There was no welcoming prayer, no scripture read aloud for comfort, no talk of forgiveness. Instead, there were confessions, forced ones. Individuals were called forward by name. Their sins were spoken for them, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Disagreement was treated as denial. Denial was treated as proof of guilt. She described voices shouting verses over one another, not in harmony, but in competition, louder and louder, until the person at the center broke down. Sometimes they screamed, sometimes they begged, sometimes they collapsed in silence. And then came the punishments. She would not describe them in detail, only said that pain was used as instruction, not as rage. Tools were involved, restraints, the kind of equipment that suggested practice, not improvisation. The worst part, she said, was the chanting, low at first, then rising, words repeated, until they lost meaning, until they became sound instead of language, and beneath it all, another sound, a deeper one, almost like breathing. She fled the Ravencroft household soon after, claiming illness. She left town within days, but rumors began to spread. Others noticed signs they had ignored before. The chapel floor felt warm on cold nights. Candles burned unevenly, dripping wax in strange patterns, and sometimes, just sometimes, screams carried upward through the stone, muffled, distorted, easy to dismiss, easy to ignore. That is, until people noticed who attended these underground sermons. They were always the same type, those who questioned too much, those accused of moral weakness, those who seemed vulnerable, and occasionally, they were never seen again. Official records list several unexplained absences during this period. Men who moved away, women who returned to family, individuals who simply vanished from census rolls without explanation. No funerals, no graves, no goodbyes, just silence. The Ravencrofts dismissed all accusations as slander. They claimed their extended sermons were acts of devotion, misunderstood by lesser minds. And in a society where faith defined morality, that defense worked. Because if the Ravencrofts were wrong, then the entire system that protected them was wrong too. Session 3 ends with realization, not that the Ravencrofts were dangerous, some already suspected that, but that what they were doing wasn't spontaneous. It was structured, systematic, refined over time. Whatever was happening beneath that chapel, it had rules. Every dark history has a moment where chaos gains direction. For the Ravencroft family, that moment had a name, a big Ale Ravencroft. If the chapel was the body, and the sermons were the voice, then Abigail was the mind, quiet, disciplined, and frighteningly precise. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She did not need to. People obeyed her because they felt watched in her presence, as if she could see straight through them, not just their actions, but their thoughts. Those who met her struggled to describe her afterward, not because she was forgettable, but because there was nothing familiar to hold on to. Abigail Ravencroft was not cruel in the way people expect cruelty to look. There were no outbursts, no visible rage, no pleasure taken in punishment. There was only certainty. She believed, completely, that she was right. Born into strict religious order, Abigail learned early that emotion was weakness, compassion was dangerous, love was unpredictable. God, she was taught, did not comfort. God corrected, and correction required firmness. She carried that belief into adulthood like scripture carved into bone. In the Ravencroft household, Abigail controlled everything that mattered: schedules, meals, prayer times, discipline, silence. Even her husband deferred to her judgment in spiritual matters, especially in spiritual matters. Children learned quickly that their father delivered punishment, but their mother decided when it was deserved, and her standards were absolute. What made Abigail different, what made her terrifying, was not that she lacked emotion, it was that she replaced it with doctrine. When her first child died, the village expected grief. They did not get it. The child had fallen ill suddenly. Fever, convulsions, a short violent sickness that left his small body cold by morning. Neighbors gathered. Women whispered condolences. Some wept openly. Abigail did not. She stood at the foot of the bed, hands folded, face composed, eyes dry. When someone finally asked how she was holding up, Abigail responded calmly, "God removes what is impure." That sentence did something to the room. It didn't shock people immediately. It unsettled them, because it suggested something unthinkable, that her own child's death was not a tragedy, but a correction. From that day forward, discipline intensified. Children were woken earlier. Prayers grew longer. Mistakes were punished faster. Abigail began attending the underground sermons personally. She did not lead them publicly, but witnesses later claimed her presence changed everything. When she was there, punishments became quieter, more controlled, more deliberate. People broke faster. She would stand at the edge of the room listening, not to what was being said, but to how it was said. Fear, to her, was information. She believed God spoke through suffering. That pain stripped away lies. That truth emerged when the body was pushed far enough. And she believed it was her duty to push. One former attendee, one of the few who survived and later escaped, described her gaze as empty, but focused, not angry, not sad, not cruel, intentional. The worst thing, he said, was that she never touched anyone. She didn't have to. Her approval was what mattered. If she nodded, the punishment continued. If she turned away, it stopped. Her silence decided who deserved mercy and who did not. Over time, Abigail's influence extended beyond the chapel. She advised which families needed spiritual core, action, which individuals were becoming morally weak, which children required stricter guidance, and always, she framed her decisions as protection. Protection of the community, protection of the soul, protection from divine punishment. That framing worked because it allowed others to participate without feeling responsible. They weren't harming people, they were saving them. Abigail Ravencroft never ordered violence. She only defined necessity, and necessity is a powerful excuse. By the time more disappearances occurred, quiet ones, undocumented ones, Abigail's authority was unquestioned. People feared her, but they also depended on her certainty. In uncertain times, someone who claims absolute truth becomes dangerous. Session 4 ends with a realization the audience feels, even if no one in the village fully understood. Yet, the Ravencrofts were no longer reacting to faith. They were enforcing it. And Abigail Ravencroft was no longer serving God. It started with whispers, the kind of whispers that only children notice, soft, fleeting, almost polite, yet impossible to ignore. In the 1740s, a young boy named Samuel Ravencroft, barely 8 years old, began to speak things no one could understand. He claimed that voices spoke to him at night, not in the walls, not in the trees, not imagined. Voices, clear, distinct, calling from somewhere below the chapel. He told his family, calmly, that they were not angels, that they were not holy, that they were waiting. He was ignored at first. Abigail considered him unformed, still childish. His older siblings laughed, nervously. His father said nothing, as usual, but Samuel persisted. "I hear them," he said during Mea. "Else." His small hands folded over the table. "They want us to go down." "Down where?" his mother asked, her voice steady, unnerving in its calm, to the stones beneath the chapel. "They are not kind," he whispered. At that moment, something changed. Not in the boy, not yet. In the house, in the chapel, in the air itself. The servants reported cold drafts that seemed to follow him, drafts that moved against the flow of the wind. Dogs cowered when he approached the basement door. Candles extinguished themselves when he entered a room. Shadows grew longer than they should have, bending at impossible angles. Samuel's insistence drew attention. Fear followed him like a shadow, but no one could articulate why the night he refused to enter the basement for evening prayers, Abigail was called in. Her reaction was unlike anything before. No anger, no shock, no visible disappointment. She looked at him, studied him, and then she spoke words that no one would ever forget. "Fear them if you must, but never defy your path. They do not forgive hesitation." That sentence echoed through the family in a way that reverberated far beyond that night. 3 days later, Samuel fell ill, a fever, convulsions, loss of speech, and then silence. By the 4th day, he was dead. Official records claimed an unknown illness. Village doctors shrugged, but those who had seen the boy in his final days whispered something different, that he had not died from sickness. He had been taken not by disease, but by what he had seen. The family buried him quietly. No tears, no lamentation. Only Abigail's calm statement, "The divine has reclaimed him. His warnings are no longer necessary." But Samuel's warning, GS didn't die with him. Servants reported hearing soft whispers in empty hallways. At night, children would awaken screaming about voices calling their names from below the chapel floor. Animals would refuse to enter the house entirely, barking at nothing, retreating as though sensing a presence no human eye could see. The community grew uneasy, not only because of the disappearances, but because of the fear that lingered in the living. Something had seeped into the household, a force that spoke, moved, and watched, feeding on innocence, growing stronger with silence and obedience. Samuel's death marked a turning point. Before him, the Ravencroft sphere was disciplined, measured, private. After him, the house became a crucible of inevitability, an experiment in obedience, terror, and fate. Every child born after Samuel carried with them the same eerie connection: dreams of darkness, whispers from below, a sense of being observed even in sunlight. And the most chilling detail, those who survived these encounters never spoke of what they heard. Not in full, not because they couldn't, because speaking it aloud felt like summoning it again. Samuel was the first to hear the truth, and the first to die for it. Session 5 ends with a singular, haunting thought for the audience. Fear is not always external. Sometimes it whispers from within. Sometimes it chooses its victims. And Samuel was its first. Horror is never truly terrifying when it's hidden. Fear thrives in shadows, whispers in what people cannot see. But sometimes, fear steps into the light. The year was 1750. The village surrounding the Ravencroft Chapel had long whispered rumors of children disappearing, of servants fleeing in terror, of a cold, unfeeling matriarch named Abigail, who judged life and death with the precision of a surgeon. No one dared speak openly. Until one woman did. Her name has been lost to time. The only records are vague references, an outsider or a village woman accused. But what happened that night was documented in fragmented journals, letters, and the sparse memory of terrified onlookers. The woman had been accused of witchcraft. Some said she had knowledge of herbs. Some said she cursed a neighbor's livestock. Some said nothing at all, that her existence alone unnerved Abigail. Whatever the reason, she was brought to the chapel, not to trial, not to question, but to confess, under fire, literally. The doors were locked. Candles burned along every wall, illuminating faces frozen in devotion. The family sat in their formal pews, rigid, perfectly still. The accused woman stood in the center, her hands tied, her face pale, eyes wide, full of disbelief. Abigail approached her slowly, calmly, purposefully, every step measured. "Confess," she said. "Repent for the sins that stain your soul." The woman insisted she was innocent. Her pleas were polite, reasonable, impossible to dismiss, but in the Ravencroft worldview, reasoning was irrelevant. Justice was not negotiation. Sin demanded correction. By the time the fire was lit, the congregation had formed a circle around her. No one flinched. No one spoke. The flickering flames reflected in their eyes, calm and detached. Observers later recalled, it felt like watching ritual, not murder. The fire consumed the woman slowly. Screams echoed in the chapel, bouncing off stone walls, filling the rafters. Yet, strangely, no one outside the circle reacted immediately. No one ran. No one screamed. They were witness, judge, and participant, united in belief. When the flames died down, witnesses swore they could still hear her voice, softly, distorted, repeating the last words she had said. They do not forgive hesitation. The family treated this as divine approval. The villagers never forgot. Parents warned children to avoid the Ravencroft Chapel after sunset. Men crossed the street when they walked past the house. Dogs refused to enter the yard entirely. Even years later, the story of the burning confession haunted conversations, journals, and family histories. But what made it horrifying was not the flames. It was the calm, the detachment, the calculated righteousness of Abigail and her congregation, the way cruelty became law under the guise of faith, the way fear could be taught and reinforced, so that people participated willingly, thinking they were serving God. And then came the subtle details that historians piece together decades later. The bell rang repeatedly in the days following the event, though no one touched it. Animals that had been present refused to cross the chapel threshold ever again. Shadows in the chapel appeared distorted, moving contrary to the candlelight. It was as though the chapel itself remembered the woman's suffering, as though the building itself bore witness. Session 6 does not end with death. It ends with an understanding. Horror is public. It is observed. It is sanctioned by belief. And when a community silently agrees to the narrative, when fear becomes obedience, cruelty no longer needs justification. That night, Abigail Ravencroft demonstrated something terrifyingly human. The intersection of faith and terror is unstoppable. From that point forward, the village learned a lesson they would carry forever. Disobedience is fire, silence is survival, and some confessions are never meant to be made. The Ravencroft Chapel had always been strange, even before the disappearances, before the whispers, even before Abigail had fully taken control. There was something in the air about that building that unsettled people who walked past it. At first, it was subtle. The wind seemed to bend differently near the stone walls. On warm summer days, the air inside felt unexpectedly cold. Candles flickered without explanation, though no drafts could be felt. Even shadows sometimes lingered longer than their sources. Villagers dismissed these things. Older folks whispered that stone walls kept heat poorly. Children were easily frightened. Dogs barked at everything. But over time, those dismissals gave way to fear. It began with the servants. The few who remained long enough to witness the late-night rituals began reporting things that made no sense. Floorboards seemed to shift underfoot, though inspections revealed nothing out of place. Walls seemed to exhale, faintly at first, like a breath carried through cracks in the stone. Doors that had been closed minutes before were suddenly ajar. Candles would extinguish themselves, then reignite with no one touching them. And always, always, a faint odor lingered. Not smoke, not rot, not decay. Something alive. Warm, metallic, unsettling. Those who noticed it could not describe it fully, only that it made their skin crawl, made their heartbeat irregular, made their instincts scream to leave the building and never return. The first recorded incident occurred on a winter evening in 1765. A young girl, no more than 10, had been sent to fetch water from the chapel's basement. She had gone countless times before. That night the steps felt different beneath her feet. Hard stone became uneven, almost pulsing under her palms as she descended. She swore she could feel the walls shift ever so slightly, bending inward toward her. She froze at the bottom. There, in the faint glow of the oil lamp, the basement walls seemed to move, not with wind, not with human hands, but with some deep, slow rhythm, like the building itself inhaled and exhaled. The girl ran upstairs screaming. Servants arrived to find her trembling, eyes wide, pointing at walls that now appeared perfectly still. Yet she insisted over and over that the chapel had been breathing. No one believed her. No one dared acknowledge that what she said might be true. But the pattern could not be ignored. Over the next weeks, multiple incidents were recorded in private journals. The air inside the chapel shifted in unnatural ways. Some nights it became oppressively hot, then suddenly icy, as if the building were aware of who stood inside. Shadows sometimes moved independently of their owners, creeping along walls, merging into forms that were vaguely humanoid, vaguely animal, and yet impossible to define. The effect was cumulative. Visitors often left exhausted, their pulses high, their thoughts racing. They could not explain the sensation, only that it persisted for days. Sleep became erratic. Some complained of hearing whispers when no one else was around, a cold, deliberate sound of air moving as if the building were inhaling their fears, waiting, judging. By now, the village had started to notice. Parents forbade their children from approaching the chapel. Dogs refused to enter its grounds. Even the bravest men would linger outside during repairs, muttering prayers under their breath. Inside the walls, he Ravencrofts remained unmoved. To them, the chapel's behavior was normal. Perhaps it always had been. Perhaps the building itself had always been a participant, not a backdrop. It had always waited, patient, observing, alive in ways that were invisible to the uninitiated. The first witnesses who dared speak of it described a horrifying realization: the chapel was not passive. It responded to emotion, to fear, to obedience, to defiance, and above all, to the presence of those it had chosen to scrutinize. By the end of that year, reports became impossible to ignore. Multiple people who had entered the chapel alone or without Abigail present reported that walls seemed to contract around them, subtle pressure against their chests, slow and deliberate. Steps echoed when no one moved. Candle flames bent as if pulled by an unseen force. And occasionally, faint, rhythmic sounds were heard, soft, slow, like inhalation and exhalation. The villagers eventually whispered the name, the breathing church. No one went near it at night. No one entered without a guide. And yet, despite this fear, the Ravencrofts continued their services as if nothing were happening. Because they knew something the village did not. The building was alive, and it was waiting. The winter of 1793 was harsh, even by New England standards. A full moon hung in the sky like a cold silver witness, illuminating the snow-covered fields surrounding the Ravencroft chapel. Villagers who dared to walk past the building at night spoke of a chill that was not entirely from the air. It was as if the stone itself exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that pressed against the chest of anyone nearby. By this time, the Ravencrofts had become a family of whispers, stories of vanished children, servants fleeing in terror, and walls that moved like living beings had spread through the neighboring towns. The chapel, once a place of devotion, had taken on a reputation that bordered on legend. It was no longer merely a house of worship. It had become a stage for fear itself. And on this night, 13 individuals, strangers, vulnerable souls, those deemed morally weak or in need of purification, were to participate in a ritual the Ravencrofts called the Night of 13 Prayers. The event was meant to cleanse them, the family claimed, of sin and spiritual impurity. No one outside the chapel fully understood the purpose. Rumors suggested divine intent. Others whispered of something older, something more sinister, embedded in the stones themselves. The participants arrived one by one as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. Their breaths formed clouds in the frigid air. Hands trembled in anticipation or fear. Some clutched rosaries. Others simply folded their arms, trying to contain unease. They were met at the chapel doors by a Ravencroft servant, silent and motionless, who gestured for them to enter without a word. Inside, the air was still. Candlelight flickered along the walls, reflecting in the polished wooden pews. The chapel smelled faintly of smoke and wax, but beneath that was something else, a metallic tang that made stomachs churn and fingers numb. No one spoke, not a single greeting, not a question, not a hesitation. Silence dominated the space, and in silence the building seemed to awaken. Shadows shifted along the walls in ways that defied the source of the candlelight. Some moved independently, stretching long and thin. Others gathered in corners like living things, waiting. Those unfamiliar with the chapel felt their heartbeats accelerate. It was subtle at first, a pressure against the chest, a tightening around the ribcage as though the air itself were aware of them. The first to notice it was a young man named Elias. He had been selected for reasons unknown to him, and as he walked down the aisle toward the altar, he felt the floorboards give ever so slightly beneath his weight. Nothing in the structure had changed. The steps were solid, ancient, yet somehow pliable, almost as if the building had remembered him, calculated the impact of each footfall, and adjusted accordingly. Elias looked around nervously. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift when he turned his head. The candle flames flickered toward him, elongating, bending as though drawn by unseen fingers. One of the older women, Mary, whispered a prayer. It was polite, almost timid, more a habit than conviction. She noticed the air grow warmer as she spoke, yet simultaneously icy drafts swept along the walls. It was contradictory, impossible. But the sensation was undeniable. The chapel was not inert. It reacted, it responded, and it was watching. As more participants settled into the pews, the tension grew. Each candle seemed to burn brighter or dimmer, based on the movement of those inside. Each breath echoed louder than natural, bouncing off stone and wood, magnified, distorted. The Ravencrofts themselves, seated at the front, remained perfectly still. Abigail, now aged but as commanding as ever, watched each person with a gaze that felt like it could pierce the soul. Her presence was calm, unnerving in its quiet authority. She did not speak, she did not gesture, she merely observed, and in her observation the chapel itself seemed to shift. Then the first faint sound came, soft, almost imperceptible, like the hiss of air escaping a stone. The participants paused. A candle flickered violently, casting elongated shadows across faces twisted in anxiety. The sound repeated, more distinct this time, a low, rhythmic pulse, like the inhalation of a giant lung hidden in the walls. No one had moved a muscle, yet the pressure increased. Hands clenched in prayer, knees stiffened, eyes darted nervously around the room. It was in this moment, as fear began to take hold, that the building revealed its first full secret, subtle vibrations underfoot. Not enough to knock anyone down, not enough to be recognized as mechanical, but present. A pulse that matched the rhythm of the strange, low-breathing sound. Heartbeats accelerated in response. Some of the participants began to sweat despite the cold, shivering in nervous anticipation. Elias reached out to steady himself on a pew, and as he did he felt a faint resistance. The wood beneath his fingers seemed to yield and then push back ever so slightly, almost as if the floor were alive, responsive, aware. He pulled his hand back instinctively. Around him, others began whispering nervously to each other, though no words could be clearly heard over the building's subtle movements. The Ravencrofts, still seated, remained statuesque, but their silence added weight to the experience. Participants realized that this was no ordinary ritual. The chapel itself was an actor in the ceremony, a silent, living participe. Ant in the night of 13 prayers. It did not merely observe, it judged, it measured, it reacted, and it would not be denied. Outside, the wind howled across the snow-covered fields, a stark contrast to the unnatural, rhythmic breathing inside. The village knew the chapel was active. They knew strange things happened within its walls. But on this night, even the oldest and most fearful dared not intervene. Those outside could only wait and listen, powerless. As the stone and timber prepared to consume the 13 souls who had entered, the first step toward terror had been taken. The participants had entered. The candles flickered, the walls exhaled. And in the silence that followed, each person realized, subtly at first, then with growing certainty, that the building would not let them leave the same as they had arrived. The village had long learned a simple rule: never speak the Ravencroft name aloud at night. Whisper it only behind closed doors. Never allow children to mention it. Never, under any circumstances, approach the chapel after sunset. And yet, despite decades of avoidance, people could not unhear the stories. Tales of vanished children, Strange sermons, breathing walls, and whispers that came from nowhere were ingrained in memory. They haunted every family, every household, every winter wind that cut through the empty fields. By the late 1790s, the full scope of the Ravencroft's power was understood only by those who had survived encounters inside the chapel. Survivors were few, and they were never fully human afterward. Their eyes carried a distant, haunted glaze. Their sleep was troubled. They muttered prayers under their breath even during daylight hours. And in those rare moments when they attempted to recount what had occurred, words failed them. They described the chapel as living, as aware, as breathing, and the people inside were never alone, not even in their thoughts. The events leading to the final disappearance of the 13 prayers participants had not been fully documented. Many records were destroyed, hidden, or deliberately altered. What survived suggested the same terrifying pattern: fear amplified, obedience rewarded, defiance punished, and the building itself participating in the judgment. The survivors of that night described it as a living nightmare. The walls shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing force. Candle flames bent toward them as though guided by unseen hands. Shadows merged into forms, sometimes resembling faces, sometimes twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer and whisper simultaneously. Voices overlapped, repeating confessions, lies, and fears in a crescendo of impossible dissonance. Some participants vanished completely. Others were left behind, trembling and broken, their bodies intact but their minds forever fractured. Those who survived became reluctant witnesses. They could not explain what had claimed the others, only that the building itself had chosen. It was selective, calculating, sentient, and it had a memory. Outside, the village watched as flickers of candlelight inside the chapel sometimes formed shapes, as if the building were breathing fire or life. On rare occasions, villagers glimpsed shadows pressing against windows, contorting unnaturally. Attempts to intervene failed. Doors would not budge, and when forced, the interior would appear empty, silent, still, as if nothing had happened at all. By this time, the Ravencrofts had become mythic figures in the eyes of the community. Abigail, older now but unchanged in her commanding presence, had extended the family's influence beyond the village. Her children and grandchildren carried the same discipline, the same cold precision. They did not need to punish openly. Fear alone sufficed. Fear ensured obedience. Fear ensured survival. And always, the chapel watched. The survivors, when finally able to speak, told horrifying tales. They described the building itself as a participant, not a backdrop. It reacted to emotion, to hesitation, to disobedience. Walls pulsed subtly, as if breathing. Floors flexed beneath weight. Shadows moved independently, and whispers echoed with knowledge of the deepest fears of those inside. One survivor, an elderly man by the time he recounted the tale, described a sensation that never left him. I felt the chapel watch my soul, not just my body. Every thought, every doubt, every fleeting feeling of defiance, it knew, and it punished in silence. It was this silence that terrified people the most. No screams, no cries for help, just the unrelenting awareness of being observed and judged by a force older than any human understanding. The Ravencroft family reinforced this fear through ritual and routine. Sermons grew longer, prayers repeated with mechanical precision, and attendance was enforced with the quiet threat of disappearance. New servants and children were trained quickly to obey, to fear, to endure. Mistakes were corrected subtly at first, then more harshly. And always the chapel's presence magnified the dread. Not merely humans. The chapel was not merely a building. Together, they were a system, a living, breathing, observing entity that thrived on fear, manipulated belief, and endured beyond the limits of comprehension. And the most terrifying truth of all, some places, some legacies never forget. Even centuries later, the chapel still watches, still breathes, still judges. No one who entered, willingly or unwillingly, could ever leave unmarked. 2 centuries had passed since the last documented disappearance at the Ravencroft Chapel. The village had long moved on, its roads widened, houses rebuilt, forests slightly reclaimed by human settlement. The chapel remained, stone and timber, weathered by snow, wind, and time, but still standing, stubbornly, impossibly, as if nothing had dared touch it in centuries. Yet stories refused to die. Old journals resurfaced in private collections. Whispered accounts of the breathing church circulated among historians and occult enthusiasts alike. And in the modern era, curiosity became technology, cameras, sensors, audio recorders, and digital tools that promised to capture the unexplainable. A small team of investigators arrived in the village one December evening, led by Dr. Lillian Hayes, a cultural historian and folklorist. They were determined to document the chapel using the latest equipment: thermal cameras, high-sensitivity microphones, and night vision drones. Lillian had read every surviving account, from Abigail's journals to fragmented survivor testimonies. She believed there was truth behind the legend. And unlike the villagers before her, she intended to prove it. Her team consisted of 4 others. Evan, a skeptical Struck. Turrell, engineer, fascinated by old buildings, but dismissive of supernatural claims. Maya, a sound analyst, who had spent years studying inexplicable acoustic phenomena in abandoned structures. Julian, a photographer obsessed with capturing what no one else could see. Theo, a graduate student in folklore, quietly terrified but eager to witness history firsthand. They arrived at dusk, the chapel looming against the pale winter sky. Even in daylight, the building exuded a strange aura. The stones seemed colder than the surrounding air, shadows clinging unnaturally to crevices as though reluctant to let go of the light. The wooden doors were darkened with age, blackened in patches, yet somehow inviting, daring them to step inside. The team hesitated. It was the first test, instinct versus reason. They reminded themselves this was a structure, no more sentient than any other ancient building. Yet something about the still air, the absence of sound beyond their footsteps, pressed upon them like a living weight. Inside, the familiar scents lingered: wax, smoke, faint iron, the unmistakable tang of something old, something preserved, something alive. Candle holders were still intact, dust-covered pews lined the walls, and the stone floors were perfectly intact despite centuries of neglect. The chapel's interior reflected its history, the imprint of fear, ritual, and obedience embedded in the wood and stone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the chapel began to change. Shadows elongated unnaturally, bending toward corners, pooling against walls. The team noticed immediately the building was responding to their presence. Temperature fluctuations rippled through the air. Bursts of warmth, followed by icy drafts. Julian whispered under his breath that the space felt aware. Then the first sound emerged, a low exhale, faint but undeniable, rising from the stone floors. Maya immediately adjusted her microphones, detecting a pulse, subtle vibrations, almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. The team froze. Each heartbeat accelerated. Each breath became conscious. For the first time, all skepticism wavered. The chapel was alive. Theo stepped forward cautiously. It's breathing," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pulse. The others turned toward him. Lillian's eyes narrowed. She had read survivor testimonies claiming precisely this phenomenon, but sensing it firsthand triggered a visceral reaction. This was not legend. This was history, alive, palpable, and terrifying. They spread out cautiously, each step measured, aware that the floors, walls, and shadows seemed to track them. Cameras and sensors recorded anomalies, faint distortions in the air, temperature spikes where no heat sources existed, and whispers caught in audio playback that were not audible in real time. It was then that Julian's flashlight flickered. A shadow detached itself from the wall and moved independently. It approached slowly, then receded when he held his gaze. No rational explanation sufficed. It was neither human nor animal. The building's pulse quickened as though aware of fear. The team realized a chilling truth. The chapel was not merely a structure. It was sentient, reactive, and selective. It knew when someone doubted, when someone feared, and when someone might resist. Fear was a key, obedience a shield. Any deviation could trigger consequences. The team was not prepared to witness. Lillian, sensing the rising tension, instructed the team to document everything calmly. "Remember," she said quietly, "we are here to observe, not provoke." Her voice barely carried, yet it resonated strangely in the space, as if the chapel itself echoed her words, stretching them unnaturally. By the time darkness fell fully, the team was immersed in the same terror described in survivor accounts centuries ago. Shadows pooled and twisted in corners, candles flick, arid in impossible directions. A faint rhythm, inhale, exhale, pulsed through the walls. The chapel had awakened fully, and it was aware of them. No one noticed the first disappearance. Theo stepped into the rear aisle, drawn by a soft whisper. One moment he was there, the next, gone. The team barely had time to react. The door through which he had entered stood solid, unbroken, no trace of exit. Only a faint draft, a metallic scent, and an eerie silence remained. Panic surged, but logic battled fear. The others tried to regroup, to rationalize, to record evidence, yet the chapel had already chosen its rhythm, and they were now participants in a centuries-old cycle of observation, judgment, and terror. The snow had melted, leaving the fields around the Ravencroft Chapel damp and gray. It was a quiet morning, but the air carried a subtle unease, one that clung to the bones of anyone daring to cross the threshold of history. The modern team had returned, unable to resist the pull of the mystery, though few could admit why. Fear was only half the reason. Fascination, the other. Dr. Lillian Hayes led the group back to the chapel. After the events of the previous night, none of them were untouched by terror. Theo was gone, and his absence weighed heavily on the rest. Julian refused to speak much, and even Evan the skeptic moved with a heightened awareness of shadows and sounds. Maya quietly adjusted her equipment, scanning for anomalies, her hands trembling slightly. The chapel itself loomed, unchanged yet charged with centuries of memory. From the outside it appeared dormant, silent. But those who had entered before knew better. The stone walls carried the pulse of histo, Rye, echoes of past fear, obedience, and death. The building had a rhythm, subtle yet insistent, that seemed to reach out, brushing the nerves of the living like a cold wind. As they entered, a strange stillness engulfed them. The air smelled faintly of wax and iron, as if the centuries of rituals had seeped into the very walls. Shadows clung to corners and alcoves, pooling unnaturally. The floorboards groaned underfoot, but not in response to weight. It was a whisper, a subtle vibration that mimicked the heartbeat of the building itself. Maya's equipment began picking up faint frequencies. At first, she assumed it was interference, but the patterns were too precise. Low, rhythmic pulses echoed through the stone, like breaths exhaled by the building. It wasn't air, it wasn't wind, it was alive. Then came the first auditory illusion, a whisper, soft, clear, speaking in voices that were not human. Do not step forward. Do not resist. It seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. Each team member froze, as if the chapel itself had penetrated their thoughts. Even Julian, the most composed of the group, swallowed hard. Lillian guided the team deeper into the interior, past the altar and toward the shadowed pews where history had etched itself into every surface. Her mind raced, piecing together the centuries of events she had studied.